Okay, good morning everyone. Happy Tuesday. Hope the rest of your day was good yesterday. I hope you're all not too hot and sweaty and melty because of how warm it's been, but today it's supposed to be a little cooler, so I think we might be okay. But it's been warm for Canada anyway. I know some of you are from warmer areas than this, but us Canadians can't really handle the heat, so we get a little bit wilted when it gets this warm, or at least I do anyway. Yeah, okay. Banamer's here. Good morning, Banamer. Good morning, Karen. Good evening to you, Thika. Good evening, Ivan. Good morning, KC. Good morning, Baha. Jenna's here. Good morning, Jenna. And Duong's here. Good morning, Duong. Monica's here too. Hello, Monica. So as people trickle in, we will, what we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit more about ableism. I have something for you to read. I have a little video for you to watch, a very short video for you to watch, and just a couple of questions for you to answer. And that should take us through today, and it should finish ableism for us. And so again, it's a short topic. I don't have a ton of things to say about it. Like all forms of oppression, we could continue on and discuss it in far more detail than we have. But we don't have very much time left, and so I'm just going to leave it as it is. But again, it'll give us a little bit of a window into what ableism is. Maybe there'll be a little bit of it tomorrow too. Maybe I'll throw some statistics at you tomorrow. But today what we'll do is we'll review the video we watched yesterday with Adam Pearson. I'll get you to read something. I'll get you to watch a short video. And I'll talk a little bit about citations too. I'm not entirely ready to do that, but we seem to be running out of time, and so I think I'll just kind of go for it, and hopefully it'll turn out well, okay? So toward the end of class, I'll talk a little bit more about citations, because I think, Baha, I think you had made a request for me to do that, and I'll try to do a good job, even though I don't have slides prepared or anything ready to go. I'll try to talk about it anyway. And Mashid's here. Good morning, Mashid. Okay, that said, let's jump in, okay? So, yesterday we watched a little documentary called The Ugly Face of Disability Hate Crimes, right? And so, in that documentary we met, maybe I'll leave this on. In that documentary we met a guy named Adam Pearson, right, who is a guy from the UK. He apparently does a little bit of acting. He was in a movie with Scarlett Johansson, as he points out, called Under the Skin. And he sort of took us through some of his experiences. He talked a little bit about his life prior to stardom, Hollywood stardom. He talked a little bit about his earlier life. He talked a little bit about his experiences in life. So, when he walks around town, when he gets on the bus, when he goes out to the nightclub, what his experience is like. He talked to a few friends he has who are also have some sort of facial disfigurement, and talked about their experiences as well, right? And so I think what we kind of learned is that again, Adam belongs to the social group of people with disabilities, right? And like we said, that's a very diverse group. There's people with physical or mental or intellectual disabilities, people with mental illness, and people with facial disfigurements, right? And we said that Adam has a disfigurement, but he also has a bit of a disability because I think he's blind in one eye, and his sight is limited to some degree in the other one. So he has a little bit of visual disability, and he's also disfigured. And so one of the things I think that was interesting is that we clearly saw people behave differently towards him, right? So some people stared at him on the street. Some people made inappropriate or just rude comments, particularly on his YouTube page. Um, People, he said this at one point, and we'll talk about this a little bit more today. Because he had a disability or because he had a disfigurement, he became public property. Okay, so he said that, and I think what he means by that is that he isn't treated as an individual person. Okay, he's treated as a thing that doesn't require regular social human politeness. Okay, so again, people would just come up to him and say, I know you, and that's kind of a rude thing to just walk up and start pointing the finger at someone. We saw the woman in the nightclub where she was talking to the young man in the wheelchair, whose name I also can't remember, and she tells him, oh, do a wheelie, right? And you don't just tell people to do things that you don't know, right? That's super rude. But that's what he's kind of talking about, is that because he has a disability or because he has a disfigurement, people don't treat him with the normal level of politeness that you should, right? People don't act appropriately around him. They don't show him appropriate respect, right? And that's kind of what he's talking about. We saw people didn't want to sit next to him on the bus. And as he kind of dug further into this bit of hate speech that had shown up on his YouTube page, he found that people weren't too willing to help him, right? Hello, Erica, and hello, Chan, and hello, Jimmy. We found that people weren't too willing to help him, right? And so Adam tried to contact Google, and he got an email back with their policy saying that they don't tolerate hate speech, but they didn't do anything about the comments, so clearly they do. He tried to call them on the phone, but of course nobody answered, because I think Google is run by robots now and nobody real works there. He went to the police station, and the police were like, oh, well, there's nothing we can do, so, moderate your own YouTube page. So nobody really took this piece of hate speech very seriously. And as Adam dug into it a little more, he found that in fact the laws are different, right? And so the punishments for disability hate crimes are less. The punishments are less than for other types of hate crimes. And he also found that far fewer disability hate crimes were actually being convicted. And he kind of traced it back, right? He talked to that Crown prosecutor and he said, well, the reason why you're not getting people convicted of hate crimes is because they're not being charged with hate crimes, right? Crown prosecutors are not charging disability hate crimes as such. They're charging them as simple assaults or things like that. And the reason why they're doing that is because police are filing reports in which they don't characterize these incidents as hate crimes. They characterize them as, again, just a simple assault or a fight. And again, the reason why they do that is because police are embarrassed or uncomfortable about referring to someone's disability. And I tried to make a connection there yesterday with socialization, the idea that here in the West, and I don't know what it's like for you in your respective home cultures, but when someone has a disability or a disfigurement, you're not supposed to draw attention to it. You're not supposed to point or ask questions or anything like that. You're supposed to just kind of pretend it isn't there. That's kind of the way that we are taught to deal with it. You're supposed to just pretend it's not there and ignore it. And so these police officers are probably just acting on their socialization, right? And so, when Adam comes into the police station to report the YouTube comment, it won't be the police officer's first instinct to say, oh, is it because of your face? I mean, we're socialized not to do that. That would be incredibly rude. But again, maybe some extra training is needed here so that police will record these incidents as the hate speech and hate crimes that they are, so that they will be charged, so that they will be convicted and punished appropriately, right? we saw Adam do a psychological test. Well, he didn't do the test, he was part of the test, in which people measured their prejudice toward people with facial disfigurements, and then this group of people met and spent time with Adam, right? And after they did, they tested again, and they found that their prejudice decreased. And so I think the idea there is that our prejudices and our stereotypes and our preconceived ideas about groups of people don't hold up well when you actually start to interact with the people you have stereotypes against, right? We talked about some of these social messages as kind of like computer viruses, right? That you sort of absorb. They become part of your operating system, part of your programming, and you don't really know how they got there. But spending time with people and interacting with them and even befriending them actually starts to overwrite that software, right? So you can, even if you have these prejudicial ideas floating around, and even if you're not aware of them, they can slowly become mitigated, they can become changed by just interacting with different people, right? And that's encouraging, right? And so finally we saw Adam embark on a career. I'm not sure if it's a career, but of stand-up comedy, right? And so his idea was that, if people's prejudices are decreased by interacting with him, then he can actually get up on stage and interact with large numbers of people, and so that can help reduce all of their prejudice, right? And so again, I asked you the question yesterday, is that helpful or is it not? And I think in some ways it is, right? He is working to reduce prejudice and stereotypes and discrimination against people with disfigurements in the community, right? So he's doing a good thing. One thing it doesn't change, however, is the sort of larger systemic problems. And so there are legal problems with disability hate crimes, right? They are punished they are not punished as strongly as other types of hate crimes, and that's not fair, right? That sends the message to disabled people that you're not as important, right? If somebody punches you in the face, that's okay, but if somebody gets punched in the face because of their race or religion, that's really bad, and that's not fair, right? That's not a fair statement. People need equal protection, and so Adam's documentary and Adam's stand-up comedy work and his acting are all really good for mitigating prejudice against people with facial disfigurements, but it doesn't necessarily change the legal structure, and it doesn't change police training either, right? It doesn't change police training either, right? So there's some education that needs to happen for police, but also for the greater public. And so, Adam's stand-up career doesn't really help that, but that's okay. He doesn't have to do everything. He doesn't have to do everything, but he's doing something, right? He's doing something good. And again, I think it's interesting for us to note, and I asked you this question yesterday, and I think you agreed with me, that even interacting with him in this documentary, even though we're not interacting with him in real life, reduces prejudice towards him, right? And people with other facial disfigurements, because again, when you first see Adam, his face is pretty surprising, right? It is pretty outside of what most people consider to be normal, right? But the more time you spend with him, and you kind of follow him around town, and you go to his mom's house and things like that, you kind of start to see him as just a regular average guy that he is. And you kind of, the face stops being the thing that you notice so much, right? You sort of get used to it, and you stop paying attention to it. And so again, the documentary works similar to the way the psychological test worked, right? We spend time with Adam, we see what he's like, and we think, oh, okay, well, he's just a normal guy. He just looks a little different than the rest of us, but he's kind of a normal guy. Oops. Yeah, so we're talking about ableism here. We're talking about oppression of people with disabilities. And particularly what I'm trying to shine a bit of a light on here is privilege and how privilege operates, okay? You'll probably recognize this slide before because of Dory, not because of the information on it. But what I mentioned when we were talking about privilege was that as we are socialized, as we are taught sort of social norms and values in society, that socialization feels like just water to a fish, right? And so the fish doesn't really notice that water is there because the fish has always been in water. The fish has never been outside of water. And so it doesn't really perceive that the water is really there. And what I mentioned is that if this fish swims in the same direction as the current, it gets where it's going with relative ease, and it doesn't really feel the current. It doesn't feel like it's being pushed. It just feels like it's swimming along and the fish is getting where it needs to go, right? But if the fish is moving against the current, then the fish starts to feel the pressure of the water, right? The fish has to work harder to get where it's going. And this was kind of a metaphor or an analogy that I used for having privilege. When you have privilege, you are swimming with the current, right? You are swimming in the same direction as society's norms and values, and you get where you're going without undue hardship, right? And so, but again, just like the fish, you often don't notice privilege when you have it, and that's what makes privilege so hard to talk about and so hard to kind of understand, is because it's often invisible to the people who have it. And so as a result, some people like to deny that it exists at all because they don't perceive it. But it does exist. To talk about privilege here a little bit, and there'll be a bit of overlap with some other concepts, but we'll try to sort them out. I want to talk about a couple of different aspects to privilege, the external and the internal, okay? So the external and structural part of privilege and the internal and attitudinal dimensions of privilege, okay? So there's kind of an outside and an inside to this. So for the external dimensions of privilege here, privilege works in kind of three ways externally on the outside. The first way is that the norms of the dominant group are worked into the structures of society. Okay, so in other words, society is physically constructed in a way that benefits the dominant group. Okay, I'll try to give you examples of this as we go. The second one is the construction of what's normal and what's not normal, is by the dominant group. So the dominant group gets to say what normal things are, and the dominant group is often seen as the sort of default thing, the neutral thing, the sort of the average thing, okay? And finally, the invisibility of privilege for the dominant group. And we've just talked about that, the idea that many times people in dominant groups don't realize that they have privilege. It's invisible to them, okay? So three things. Society is built in such a way that dominant groups benefit. The dominant groups gets to say what is and is not normal. And the privilege that the dominant group enjoys is invisible to them, okay? So here's a good example of external structural society. Okay, so most of you will recognize this very easily as a Vancouver city bus. This looks like a COVID bus because nobody's on it. No, I'm just kidding. It's not a funny joke. Now there are some elements of structural privilege here, right? So there are seats throughout this bus, as no doubt if you've taken a bus in Vancouver, you have sat in them. But these seats are not necessarily designed for everyone, right? If you are in a wheelchair, of course, you cannot use these seats, right? If you are a larger person, if you are overweight or obese, you cannot fit in these seats. And in all honesty, even I sometimes have a little difficulty. I'm not that big, I'm 6'1", but the seats are a little on the small side. I kind of have to squish in if somebody sits beside me. And so if you are a larger person, then sitting on some of these seats is going to be difficult for you. And so people who are smaller and slimmer, people who fit society's definition of normal, and normal is in quotes there, this bus is built for them, right? People who are able-bodied. This bus is built for people who are able-bodied. This bus is built for people who are not significantly overweight. If you are, this bus is not built for you, right? And granted, there are, at the front of these buses, there are usually places where wheelchairs can sort of park. You know, you've probably seen the seats flip up and you can put your wheelchair there. But many parts of this bus are not constructed for people with disabilities, right? Here's another element of external structure of society. I don't know what it's like in your home countries if you're not in Canada. Here in Canada, though, we have these, and they're called curb cuts. And so you can see at the corner of the curb here, you can see it gets a little bit flat, right? There's a little bit of a lip there. And so people in wheelchairs can easily roll down off the curb onto the street and cross the street and then pop back up onto the sidewalk on the other side of the street. But these weren't always in place. The legal requirement to build in these curb cuts only came around in the 1990s. And so prior to that, prior to the 1990s, if you were in a wheelchair, it might be very difficult for you to kind of get around town, because what do you do if you can't get off the curb? How do you cross the street when there's a big drop? It's dangerous, right? And if you cross the street, but if you can't get onto the other part of the curb, then you're kind of stuck on the street, and that's really dangerous too. And so here we have the structure of society is, in the past at least, was purely created for people who were able-bodied, right? And so buses, I'm just gonna go back here. So nowadays we have buses that are accessible to people in wheelchairs, but in the past we did not. And I remember the buses that I took when I was going to school, when I was younger, although those buses were really old at the time, they were from the 60s and 70s, I think. But the buses I took when I was growing up didn't have any accessibility for wheelchairs. You had to go up the stairs onto the bus and sit down. And so if you were an older person with a cane or a walker, if you were in a wheelchair, you can't take the bus. The bus is not accessible to you, right? Similarly with the curb cuts, before the laws came into place to make sure that they were required, people might not be able to cross the street even, because they wouldn't be able to go down the curb if they had a wheelchair, or maybe even if they had a cane or a walker. That step down might be a little too much, right? So society was, and to some degree still is, built for people who are able-bodied, okay? Oops. So yeah, so think about ways that the way society is built disadvantages some people, right? So think about Adam Pearson, right? I wonder, I don't know for sure, but I wonder if those of you who have a newer iPhone with facial recognition, I wonder if the iPhone would recognize his face. I wonder if the phone would see that face as a human face. Right? And I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm wondering, right? Because the phone is probably programmed to recognize human faces and to store them in its memory. But will Adam's face be perceived by the phone as a human face? And what if it isn't? And how horrible would that feel, right? For the phone not to see your face as a human face. Again, people who are obese, people who are really, really heavy. Again, buses don't necessarily work for them in some cases, right? There might not be a seat available to accommodate them. The other aspect of this for people who are significantly overweight are chairs, right? So you and I, most of us don't really think about this because most of us are kind of within the parameters of normal weight, right, quote unquote. But most chairs that you sit in have a weight rating, right? And so most of them are around 200 to 220 pounds that they're rated for. So of course, all of us, will sit in these chairs and not even think twice, right? We won't think about it. That's privilege, right? You can sit in any chair you want and you don't have to worry about it. But if you weigh 400 pounds, which some people do, you can't sit in just any chair, right? Because not every chair is weight rated for you. And so if you sit in a chair that's not strong enough for you, it can collapse underneath you. It can break. And number one, imagine how humiliating and embarrassing that would be. And two, it could actually be quite dangerous, right? You could, if the chair collapses underneath you, you could hurt yourself. You could hit your head, right? It's actually quite dangerous. And so, imagine kind of walking through a world where most of the chairs that you see might not support you, right? You might not be able to sit down anywhere you want because those chairs are dangerous. They will not support your weight. And again, people who are 400 pounds and walking around, you could probably imagine they might want to sit down a little more than you or I, right? It might be quite tiring to carry that weight around. But again, they can't sit wherever they want because these chairs are just not rated for that amount of weight. And so again, they encounter this barrier, right? This is an area where we have privilege. We just walk around town and sit wherever we want and we don't think about it. But if you weigh more, if you weigh 300 or 400 pounds, then you have to be a little more careful, right? You can't sit wherever you want, and that's because society is not designed for you. What about people who can't see or can't hear? Humans are predominantly visual creatures, right? We get a lot of our information about the world through our eyes. And so if you cannot see, then how are you going to experience the world? How do you get where you're going when street signs are all visual, right? Where bus signs are visual, everything is visual. How do you participate in society when one of the major ways that we communicate information is not available to you, right? That's a major potential barrier. Of course, you and I don't think about it, right? We just walk around town and look at whatever we want and look at the internet, and we don't think about it because we have privilege, right? This is able-bodied privilege, the fact that you can use your eyes and you can look at anything you want. But some people, that's a barrier for them, right? And how do we accommodate them within society so that they have an equal opportunity, right? That's an important consideration. The second one is that dominant groups construct what's normal and what's not normal, okay? So think about a human body, okay? Think about a human body. It can be male, it can be female, whatever you want. Now, what are what are the boundaries of normal, quote unquote? So what makes a body normal or what makes a body not normal? Is it size? Is it dimensions? Is it the presence of all of the limbs or all of the parts? Is it its ability to move? Is it its ability to feel things? What makes a body normal and what makes a body not normal? Let's think about Adam Pearson. So here's Adam, of course, on the left, and here is actor-comedian Steve Carell on the right. Now, most people, I think, would probably say that Adam Pearson's face is outside of what we would regard as normal, okay? So that's why people sort of give him a second look when they see him on the street, because his face is quite different than what we consider normal. And Steve Carell here is a very normal looking guy, pretty handsome, but there is a difference between these two faces, right? Steve Carell's face falls within our definition of normal. Adam's face probably falls outside of normal, but I want you to think about what the boundary is between these two faces. So where does a face stop being quote unquote normal, and when does it start to go outside of that definition? What makes a face normal or not normal? Especially when we look at these two faces and we think, well, okay, here's Adam and here's Steve. Both of these guys have 2 ears and 1 nose and a mouth. Both of them happen to be wearing glasses. They got 2 eyes. They've got their hair styled in a, they've styled their hair. They're both dressed up for some sort of celebrity red carpet occasion, right? You can see Adam's dressed up for an award show. I can't read what award show it is, but he's got a tuxedo on and a bow tie. Steve Carell is attending some sort of other red carpet thing, so he's not wearing a tux, but he's dressed smartly, I think, as well. But again, both of these guys have, a nose and a mouth and 2 ears and 2 eyes and hair and eyebrows and a chin, and all of that is mounted on top of a neck. So, we might look at Adam's face as outside of normal, and we might look at Steve's as normal. But again, what necessarily makes something normal or not normal? And again, we don't need an answer to this. I just want you to consider it, right? Consider why we might see Adam's face as outside of normal and why we might see Steve's face as normal, even though both of these faces have the same parts, right? Noses and ears and eyes and mouths. Both of these faces do the same thing, right? Both of these faces allow these 2 guys to see. They allow these 2 guys to hear. They allow these 2 guys to speak. Their nose gives them a convenient place to rest their glasses. Both of these faces do the same thing, right? So these faces have the same parts, and their faces operate in very similar ways. Their faces do the same things. Their faces are also unique, right? There's nobody who looks like Steve Carell, and there's nobody who looks like Adam Pearson. So our faces serve as identity, right? For others to recognize us. Others can recognize us because our faces are unique. And so both of these faces are unique as well. So again, I invite you to consider what makes Adam's face outside of the boundary of normal, and what makes Steve Carell's face inside the boundary of normal. Again, you don't need to answer. It's just something to consider. Yeah, so, and by the way, this works for all forms of oppression, okay? So the construction of what's normal and not normal is done by the dominant group, okay? So anything that we think of as normal is socially constructed, And again, whether we fall into the normal or abnormal category, we are granted or denied privileges in society, right? So again, Steve Carell is kind of famous, but if Steve Carell wasn't famous, people would sit beside him on the bus, right? Yet, people don't sit beside Adam on the bus. And part of that is because Adam's face is seen as not normal, and Steve's is seen as normal. But that definition, whatever it is, of what's normal or not normal, is created by the dominant group, right? And so Adam will be denied privileges, he will suffer prejudice and discrimination because his face falls outside of what the dominant group has decided is normal. And again, the last thing is the invisibility of privilege for the dominant group. And so again, those of us who are defined as non-disabled will likely not recognize the advantages that we have as privileges, but simply normal aspects of life. And so I think I've mentioned this before, but think about when you go to school or when you go to get some food or when you go anywhere. You don't think about any of these privileges that you enjoy, right? You step up and down curbs, you go up and down stairs, you look at signs and bus numbers, you hop onto the bus, whether it's accessible for people with disabilities or not. You open doorknobs with your hands, and that's no problem. You do all these things, and you do them without even thinking about them, right? Usually, you probably got your headphones on or your earbuds in, you're listening to music, you're texting with your friend, which of course, if you can't see, texting is something that's difficult to do as well. You're texting with your friend, you're looking around, and you're not paying attention to any of these obstacles or barriers that actually exist in the environment. And the reason you're not paying attention to them is because the environment is designed for you. It is designed for your social group. And so you move through that environment very easily because of your privilege, because that environment is designed specifically for you. Okay. What have I got? Okay. There are also some internal and attitudinal effects as well. And there's a little bit of overlap here with internalized dominance and internalized oppression, if you remember those, and microaggressions as well. So there's a lot of overlap between these ideas here. But privilege has the following internal effects. So people in dominant groups tend to believe that their group has a right to their position, okay? So they feel that if, society is constructed in a way that benefits able-bodied people, that's kind of the way it should be, and they might have various arguments for that. People in dominant groups may have internalized their messages of their own group's superiority, okay? So, and again, this is a bit of an overlap with the concept of internalized dominance that we talked about already. People in dominant groups often lack humility that results from limited knowledge of the minoritized group. And so many people in the dominant group don't really know much about people in minoritized groups, and that doesn't really bother them. They're kind of okay with not knowing. They feel like they don't really need to know. And again, I'm sure you're sensing a pattern here, but again, the invisibility of privilege. And so, again, people who have privilege often don't perceive it. They don't see that they have it. And sometimes when you point it out to them, they don't believe that it exists either. Okay. So, I'm going to take a quick breath there and say, are there any questions on any of that? Does that make sense? Is there anything I should have talked about but didn't? Is there something you're confused about? Is there something you would like to say that is not a question but is just a statement? What do you think? How are we right now? Okay, so Baja's good, Karen's good, KC is nope, Nasheed says no. Okay. Okay, so what I'll do now is maybe we'll take our 10-minute break. When we come back, I have a little something for you to read. It's very short, so don't panic. It'll take you all of 5 minutes to read it. But I do want you to read it, and I do have a couple of questions for you as well. Erica says no. Okay, so yeah, a very short read when we come back with just a couple of questions. But okay, let's take our 10-minute break. When we come back, we'll read something very short and we'll talk about it. Okay, Dika's good as well. Okay, take a break. I'll see you in 10 and we'll do that. Okay. Okay, and we're back. So we've talked a little bit about how privilege works externally and internally. And so externally, society is kind of built for the dominant group. The dominant group gets to say what's normal and what's not normal. And of course, for the dominant group, their privilege is invisible to them. Okay. Internally, it has to do with dominant groups feeling superior and acting superior to people in minoritized groups. Internally, it has to do with people in dominant groups tend to be in positions of power, and they feel that that's kind of natural and normal. Sometimes people who are in dominant groups don't really know much about people in minoritized groups and don't feel that they need to. And again, their privilege is invisible to them, right? They don't see how society works in a way to benefit them. And to some degree, that's not unsurprising, because again, if society is built for you, you don't see how it's benefiting you in all cases, right? It's like the fish swimming with the current. It doesn't feel that the current is helping it along. It doesn't feel anything. It's just swimming normally. Again, it's only when you start swimming against the current, that's where you notice that you don't have privilege, right? That's where you notice obstacles. So to help us think a little bit about this, I would like you to read a short little thing that I posted. So I posted it in Microsoft Teams under Files, and it's called, I should have named it something else. It shouldn't be named this, but it's named Internal and Attitudinal Dimensions of Privilege. That's what it's called. And so in Microsoft Teams, there's this thing I would like you to read. It's very short. It's really a page, I think, is really all it is. I'd like you to read it, and then I have 3 questions for you to answer. And the questions are these. It's a little fictional story. It's a short fictional story. And so I want you to see if you can identify what the external or structural dimensions of privilege are. Okay, so how society is constructed to benefit the dominant group, how the dominant group has constructed the idea of normal or has decided what normal is, and of course invisibility of privilege. And then I also want you to look for internal or attitudinal dimensions of privilege. So people acting with superiority, people feeling that they're better than people in the minoritized group. And then I would like you to maybe just choose one, okay? I said 3 here, but maybe just choose one. Choose one example, so something that you came up with from question 1 or 2, and can you identify a similar situation in a different type of oppression? So can you see something in the story and say, oh, this happens, with racism all the time because of something, or this is similar to a sexist situation where this happens, or something like that. Okay, so can you take an example of this type of privilege or lack of privilege, and can you see it happening within a different form of oppression? Okay, so that might be tricky, but it might not be. Okay, so that's what I'll ask you to do. So go to Microsoft Teams under Files, and you'll see, again, it's Internal and Attitudinal Dimensions of Privilege is what the file is called. Read it, and then answer those questions as best you can. The questions are posted in Microsoft Teams as well. So I'll give you 10 minutes. 10 minutes is really all we should need. It's really short. So go read, go read it. And then when you come back, we can talk about it, okay? And while you're reading, what I'll do is I'll go back I'll leave this on the screen for part of the time, and then I'll go to the internal ones for part of the time as well, just so that you have something to refer to. Okay, so go read it, answer the questions, and I'll see you back here in just 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, so we're back. Nice little simple story that's kind of a little weird, right? A little bit fictional. But again, as they mention in the text, the experience of what's going on there is very common to people in some minoritized groups in some times and places. And so even though the idea of people with three eyes is fictional, the way that this story plays out is very much not fictional. The sort of experiences that the main character has, that the person has, are not, sadly, are not fictional at all. And so, what do you think? What kind of external or structural dimensions of privilege do we see? So, places where we see society is really designed for people with three eyes. Places where what's normal and not normal is evident, we see evidence of what's normal and not normal. And if we see any invisibility of privilege as well. So what do you think? Okay. Two things I'm going to say about this. So, number one, yes. So people with three eyes were treated respectfully, or at least what we saw is the person with two eyes was treated differently, right? We definitely saw that. Now, see properly is interesting because the person with two eyes that we're reading about here, they felt that they could see just fine, right? And I think all of us would agree that we all have two eyes and we can see just fine. So why do any of you want or need a third eye? Probably not, right? I don't want a third eye anywhere. So seeing properly is a matter of opinion, right? Is a matter of what's normal and not normal, right? So to see in a normal way depends on who's defining normal. And in this case, it's the people with three eyes, right? So people with three eyes are seen as normal. So where do we see that? Give me more. Give me more, give me more, give me more. There's lots of stuff happening here. There's the diner, there's the sunglasses store, there's the cafe, there's the play, there's walking down the street, all kinds of stuff. Examples, places in the story where we see three-eyed people defining what's normal and what's not normal, and the physical things in the environment, so physical parts of society that are constructed in a way that benefit three-eyed people and disadvantage two-eyed people. There's a few things, there's a few examples. Okay, so KC says, the play where someone asks if the person needs help because the person only has two eyes. That might be an internal one, so I might save that one, KC, for just a little bit later. Places where physical objects or the sort of physical environment is created for people with three eyes, or the definition of what's normal and not normal. That's what we're looking for. Okay, so here's a good one. So Casey's got, the sunglasses, right? So this person, whoever this person is with the two eyes, they go into the sunglass store and they see a bunch of really cool, trendy sunglasses, right? And so this two-eyed person starts trying them all on, and of course, these sunglasses have a lens in the back, right? So these people have an eye in the back of their head, so there's a sunglass lens in the back. But it doesn't matter, right? If you don't have an eye back there, it's fine. You can still wear the three-eyed sunglasses with two eyes. It's no problem, right? So the sunglasses are made for three-eyed people, and there are sunglasses made for two-eyed people, but they're not cool, right? They're not trendy. They're big and bulky and they look stupid, right? And so this person doesn't want to wear those. They want to wear the cool ones, right? They want to wear the ones that everyone else is wearing. So the sunglasses, the cool ones, are only designed for people with three eyes. So at the play, we see that the program, right? The little booklet that you get at the play that talks about what the play is about and where all the actors are from and all that stuff. That program, that booklet, is made in such a way that it benefits three-eyed people. So it's made to be read by you, but also by the person in front of you, because they have an eye in the back of their head, right? So it's the thing that you read is designed to be read by both of you at the same time. But for the two-eyed person, it's a little awkward. They're trying to figure out how it works, right? And so the program itself at the play, the little booklet that you get, is designed for people with three eyes, and for two-eyed people, it's a little bit awkward. It's a little bit strange to use. Yeah, but that's something else. I'm going to leave that for now. What else, people? There's more. There's way more. The sunglasses are one piece. What about the doctor? What about the doctor that approaches this person on the street? What does the doctor say? Come on, guys. There's 12 people here. Casey's doing all the work so far. Let's go. Karen. Karen says, yeah, the doctor says that they should have surgery to fit in, right? The doctor says, don't you want to be normal, right? Don't you want to be accepted like everyone else? And that's part of that external privilege, right? Because the dominant group defines what's normal, right? And so for the dominant group, 3-eyed people, 3 eyes is normal, 2 eyes is weird and gross, right? And so this doctor approaches the person and says, hey, I can add a 3rd eye, I can implant a 3rd eye. It's kind of dangerous, but then you would be normal, right? And so the person in the story, and probably most of us would feel, I am normal, right? Having 2 eyes is fine. I can see the world around me just perfectly, and I'm happy with who I am. But of course, this doctor and this society are transmitting the message that actually, no, 2 eyes is not normal, it's weird, and you should want to fix yourself, right? You should want to be like everyone else. Okay, there's that. Okay, let's talk about the internal ones. Let's talk about the internal elements here. So what kind of internal or attitudinal dimensions of privilege do we see? Internal or attitudinal? So Casey says 3-eyed people are disgusted with people who only have 2 eyes. Yes. So they are transmitting their superiority, right? So people with 3 eyes think that they are superior to people with 2 eyes, and you see that in a lot of situations, right? You see that in basically every interaction. People are uncomfortable or disgusted with people with 2 eyes, right? And we see that almost immediately, right? When the 2-eyed person, when they go into the cafe and order some food, they eat their food, they pay for it, the waitress goes to give them change, and the 2-eyed person puts their hand out for the change, and the waitress just puts it on the table because she doesn't want to touch hands to the person with 2 eyes, right? And this is pre-COVID, right? This isn't COVID touching. They don't want to touch this person because they have 2 eyes, right? So we see 3-eyed people are I guess that's true, but I think we see that more the other way. I think we see that not so much that 3-eyed people are beautiful, it's more that people with 2 eyes, 2-eyed people aren't, right? And so again, the doctor is trying to fix this person, but how do we know that? What evidence do we see in this story? How do we know that 3-eyed people are seen as as ugly or disgusting? How do we know? What's the evidence? Okay, so this is not working out. Okay, here we go. So in this story, we see a few types of external or structural dimensions of privilege that we in this story, okay? And so a couple of them we have highlighted already. We've seen them. So again, the cool sunglasses, we flagged that one, right? That the cool ones are only made in 3-eyed versions. The ones that are made for people with 2 eyes, well, they're kind of bulky and not cool, right? And people with 3 eyes don't want to, or people with 2 eyes don't want to look uncool. They want to look cool just like everyone else, right? The theater program. The theater program assumes that you have 3 eyes, and so the writing is oriented in such a way that you can read it from in front of you and behind you. But of course, that's a disadvantage for people who only have 2 eyes, right? Even though they can see just fine, the program is made in such a way that benefits 3-eyed people and disadvantages people with 2 eyes. When they go to the play, the person with 2 eyes is forced to use a cane, right? And so they're given a cane to make sure they can find their way to their seat. Of course, they don't need a cane, right? They can see just fine, but this is a structural thing, right? And suddenly everyone knows that there is a person with only 2 eyes here because they're using this cane, right? It alerts other people to their difference. Again, we talked about this one as well, right? The doctor offers surgery to make people normal, and so the dominant group decides what's normal. So in this story, in the world of this story, it's not normal for people to have eyes, or it's not normal for people to have more than 1 eye. It's normal to have 3 eyes. And so people with 2 eyes are seen as different, abnormal, less than. And again, at the very beginning of this story, we see that 2-eyed communities and 3-eyed communities are segregated, right? The 2-eyed person lives in a gated community their whole life, right? They live totally separate from the world of the 3-eyed people, right? Which is, again, another external element of privilege, is that people with 3 eyes can live separate from the minoritized group. If we look at the internal or the attitudinal dimensions of privilege here, we see that the privileged group feels comfortable invading the space of the minoritized person. So remember when the 2-eyed person is trying on the sunglasses and the salesperson says, "Oh no, dear, these aren't for you." And they take their arm and kind of guide them away from the fashionable sunglasses, right? And so for some reason, this 2-eyed person is not allowed to shop for 3-eyed sunglasses, which is not fair, right? They can wear whatever they want, but the salesperson sort of directs them away from the things that belong to the dominant group, right? have a look at this one here. I don't think we talked about this, but the privileged group feels qualified to represent the experiences of the minoritized people. So think about how the play is acted out and probably created by three-eyed people. And so in that play, we read that the play was about a three-eyed person who lost their third eye in a tragic accident. And so the message was, ugh, how awful. How could you possibly want to go on living life when you only had two eyes? How tragic and awful. And yet the two-eyed person continued on and, struggled bravely against their disability. But again, the two-eyed person is just fine, right? The two-eyed person is disadvantaged because society is constructed for three-eyed people, but there's nothing really wrong with having two eyes, right? They can move through the world just fine. But the message in the play is, to have two eyes is, ugh, how awful. How could you even want to go on with only two eyes, right? And again, the privileged group feels qualified to represent these experiences of the two-eyed people. I think in a couple places we flag the idea that the privileged group sees themselves as superior to the minoritized group. And so the minoritized group, those people, should be fixed, or that they should assimilate, right? Don't you want to have a third eye? Don't you want to be like everyone else? Shouldn't you be like everyone else? The teenage girls at the store also sort of transmit their superiority, right? They say things like, oh, what happened to you? Can you imagine being born like that? Awful, right? Awful, awful stuff. And again, the privileged group prefers to live separated from the minoritized group. These communities are separated, right? They are physically separate from each other. And again, it is probably because the dominant group does not want to live next door to the minoritized group. Okay, so I've got one more thing for you, but I think we will. I think we don't have enough time to do it. The reading of this story took a little longer than I thought. So I think what I'll do is I'll save that for tomorrow. Maybe what I will do really quickly is I will talk to you about citations. I think that might be a useful thing to do. So just give me a second here and I will find what I'm looking for. Okay. All right. So this is the website that I often send you to in order to do your citations, right? This Purdue OWL site, and I think it's pretty good. There's lots of sites out there that will talk about how to cite things, but this one I think is it's pretty decent. I'm just going to make it as big as I can here. Here we go. Okay, so when you're citing things, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit. All right, that's not what I meant to do. That's not what I meant to do. Here we go. A couple things to remember when you're citing sources, okay? Number one, the things that we want to cite are ideas and information that are not widely available, okay? So if for some reason in your paper you were writing that Homo sapiens, our species, Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, okay? Now, that's pretty commonly understood Lots of people know it, and so you wouldn't, even if you read it somewhere, you wouldn't cite it because it's kind of pretty common knowledge, okay? It's pretty common knowledge. You know, generally known scientific facts, you know, the idea that men are the dominant group in basically every society around the world. Things like that are pretty commonly known, and so the idea hasn't really been developed by one person. It doesn't involve data that has come from one particular source, and so those are the things that you don't really have to cite because again they're commonly known, right? Yeah, they're commonly known. The things that you do have to cite are if you use people's exact words, then you quote it, right? Or if you cite something that belongs to someone, okay? So for instance, think back to Shavella Pittman's article. Remember the race and gender in the classroom? There was the female professors and the white male students and that whole thing. So if you wanted to say in your paper that female professors of color experience gendered racism in the classroom, if you wanted to say that in your paper, that idea you would need to cite because that's Shavella Pittman's idea, right? That's what she talks about in her paper. That's what she's trying to convince us of, right? That's the conclusion to her argument. And so that you definitely have to cite because that's her thesis statement, right? That's her argument. So that you have to cite. If you wanted to cite data, so if you wanted to say that, 52% of Canada's population are women, that data would probably come from a source that's not widely known. So you would cite Statistics Canada or wherever that piece of data came from. So you usually want to cite data, and you usually want to cite ideas that belong to one person, like Shavella Pittman's. But things that are kind of common knowledge, again, like, sexism exists in every society. Yeah, we know that. So we don't really have to cite those kind of ideas, okay? Now, I think we talked in this class a little bit earlier, and we could go back to it, but we talked about the idea of paraphrasing, right? So restating someone else's ideas in your own words. That's really what you want to do almost all of the time. I would discourage you from quoting much of anything in a paper like this, okay? Again, the only place you want to actually quote is when you really need the person's actual words, okay? When their actual specific words are important, right? So if you were writing an English essay or an English paper and you were analyzing a sonnet by Shakespeare, then you would quote him because Shakespeare's exact words in that sonnet are important to your interpretation, right? So you would say, when Shakespeare says blah, 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 what he's really talking about is this, right? So you really need Shakespeare's words in order to convince your audience that you're correct. But for Shavella Pittman, for instance, we might not necessarily need to quote any of her words, right? We could simply phrase her argument or phrase her ideas in our own words, and then we would cite it, right? We would say Pittman, and then whatever year it was published, right? We would cite her idea. And so, again, I would discourage you in a paper like this from quoting really anything because, again, it tends to take away from your flow. It tends to take away from what you're saying. And most of the things that students want to quote in a paper like this don't really need to be quoted. You can say them in your own words, and it's actually better if you do because it'll fit in with the rest of your kind of flow. It'll fit in with what you're saying. So again, I would say don't quote, but you do have to cite. Don't cite things that are kind of broadly known by lots of people. Cite either data, so numbers or statistics that you find, or cite people's specific ideas, like Shavella Pittman's argument. That's something that should be cited. Now, again, if you go to a site like this, it will show you how to cite different types of sources. Okay, so if you have a book, then it gets cited like this. If you have a journal article, it gets cited like this. And so again, you can see that what's kind of important here is kind of where the periods and commas are, what things are italicized and what things are not. So you can see here, Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature is in italics. It's kind of leaning over to one side. And then the sort of information about volumes and numbers and dates and things like that. And so all of these things are important in the citation. So again, where the periods are, where the quotation marks are, where what's in italics and what isn't. To be honest, I'm not sure if the highlighting here is important. So you can see that some of these are in gray. I'm not sure if that's part of the style. I've never really seen that before. Again, if you're citing a website, you always want to put when it was accessed, right? Because websites can change, information can change, and so you always want to cite when you actually looked at this source, okay? Sometimes you can include a link, and if you include a link, don't include the HTTP part of it. And let me just see here what else we have. That's a book, versions, number, publisher, and so there's more kind of specific information as you go down. Okay, yeah, the highlighting is not part of the formatting here. It's just for the website. Yeah, and so again, you can see here if you're looking at an online work, remove the HTTP section from the website address, and always make sure that you put the accessed date so that we know when you looked at that source. Okay, so that was really short. I think I meant to have that be a little bit longer, but the timing didn't really work out the way I thought it would today. So we only have about 2 minutes left, so I will send you off with that. Come back tomorrow and we'll finish up ableism and maybe move on to religious oppression. Some of you I'll see in about 20 minutes in comparative cultures. So for those very few of you who did participate in the live chat, thank you very much. You did a good job. Those of you who didn't, I wonder where you were on that. But anyway, that's all for today. Come back tomorrow and we'll wrap this up, or I'll see you in 20 minutes in comparative cultures. Okay, so bye.